I was still wearing black when they served me the papers. 6 days. My husband of 41 years had been dead for exactly 6 days, and my own children, the babies I had nursed through fevers, the teenagers I had driven to every soccer practice and piano recital, the adults I had helped through divorces and business failures and moments of weakness that I had never, not once, thrown back in their faces, had hired lawyers and filed a motion in probate court to expedite the inventory and assess immediate distribution of marital assets. I remember standing in the foyer of our home, the home Richard and I had built together, the home where we had celebrated 30 Christmases and 20 Thanksgivings, and one terrible quiet Tuesday in March when the doctor called and used words like aggressive and inoperable. And I remember holding that envelope and feeling something I had never felt before in my entire life. Not grief. I was already drowning in grief. Not anger. Anger would come later, sharp and clarifying and necessary. What I felt in that moment was something colder, something that settled into my chest like ice water and stayed there, perfectly still, perfectly quiet. It was the feeling of a woman who suddenly understood, with absolute and terrible clarity, exactly who her children were. The papers were served by a young man in a grey suit who couldn't quite meet my eyes. He held the envelope out at arm's length, the way you might offer food to an animal you weren't sure about. And when I took it from him, he said, "I'm sorry for your loss, ma'am," in a voice that made it clear he was not sorry at all, that this was simply a Tuesday for him, that my entire world collapsing was just another item on his delivery manifest. I thanked him. I closed the door. I set the envelope on the marble console table in the foyer, the one Richard had picked out at an antique shop in Savannah on our 25th anniversary trip. The one I had always thought was a little too ornate, but had never said so because it made him so genuinely, boyishly happy. And I walked to the kitchen and I made myself a cup of tea. Earl Grey, Richard's favorite. I had been making it for him every morning for 4 decades, and now I made it for myself because I didn't know what else to do with my hands. I sat at the kitchen table and I drank my tea, and I looked out at the garden where the roses Richard had planted the spring before his diagnosis were just beginning to bud despite the October cold. Stubborn and red and alive, and I thought about the USB drive in the drawer of Richard's study. I thought about the afternoon he had pressed it into my hands 3 weeks before he died, when the house was quiet and the hospice nurse had stepped out, and it was just the two of us in the room that had once been our bedroom, and had slowly, over 8 months, become something else entirely. A room of tubes and medications, and the particular unmistakable smell of a body in the process of leaving. Lizzie, he had said. He was the only person in the world who called me Lizzie. Everyone else called me Elizabeth. My mother when she was disappointed in me, my children when they wanted something, my colleagues when they needed to seem respectful. But Richard had called me Lizzie since our third date, since the night he'd told me I was the most interesting woman he'd ever met. And I'd laughed and said that was the saddest thing I'd ever heard. And he'd laughed too. And something had shifted between us that neither of us ever tried to name. "Lizzie," he said, and I took his hand, and he looked at me with those grey eyes that had watched me through everything, through the miscarriage before Daniel was born, through my mother's death, through the years when the business was struggling and we didn't know if we'd be able to keep the house. And he said, "I need you to be strong. Not brave, strong. There's a difference." I told him I didn't understand. He told me I would. He pressed the USB drive into my palm and he closed my fingers around it and he said, "Don't open it until you need it. You'll know when." I had wanted to ask him more. I had wanted to ask him everything. All the questions I had been saving up, all the things I had assumed we would have time to discuss properly, all the conversations I had been postponing for a later that was rapidly running out. But he was tired, and the nurse came back, and Daniel arrived with his wife Courtney and their two perfect children. And the moment passed the way moments do, suddenly, irrevocably, without permission. He died 11 days later on a Wednesday morning, with the light coming through the curtains in long golden bars and the sound of birds in the garden, and my hand in his, and it was peaceful, and it was terrible, and it was the end of the life I had known. And then, 6 days later, someone knocked on my door with an envelope. Before I tell you what happened in that courtroom, and I am going to tell you every single detail, because you deserve to understand all of it, the full shape of the betrayal and the full shape of what came after. I need you to understand who I am and where I come from, and how I became the woman sitting in that kitchen with her Earl Grey tea and her dead husband's roses and a USB drive that she had not yet opened. If this story resonates with you, if you've ever been underestimated by the people who were supposed to love you most, please subscribe to this channel and give this video a like. Leave a comment below telling me if you've ever been betrayed by family. I read every single one. And stay with me until the end, because I promise you, what's on that USB drive is going to change everything you think you know about this story. My name is Elizabeth Hargrove, and I grew up in a small town in western Pennsylvania called Mill Haven, which is the kind of place that is either charming or suffocating depending on your disposition and your circumstances. And for me, it was mostly the latter. My father worked at the mill. Everyone's father worked at the mill, which is how the town got its name and also how it got its particular character. That combination of hard work and quiet resignation that settles over a place when generation after generation of men pour their lives into the same building for the same modest wages and come home with the same tired eyes. My mother was a practical woman, not cold. She loved us in the way that practical women love their children, fiercely and without much ceremony, through packed lunches and mended clothes, and the kind of sacrifice that is never announced because it never occurs to the person making it that it might be worth announcing. She had wanted to be a teacher. She had completed 2 years of college before she married my father, and those 2 years lived in her like a small banked fire that never quite went out. She read constantly. She made us read. She believed, with a conviction that bordered on religious, that education was the one thing that could not be taken from you. I was the oldest of three. Below me were my brother Thomas, who was quiet and mechanically gifted and spent most of his adolescence rebuilding car engines in the garage, and my sister Carol, who was beautiful and restless and left Mill Haven the week after high school graduation and never really came back except for holidays, and even then seemed to be already mentally somewhere else. I was the one who stayed, not because I lacked ambition. I had plenty of ambition, perhaps too much for the circumstances, the way a plant can have too much root system for the pot it's in, but because I felt the pull of obligation more acutely than either of my siblings. My father's health was not good. My mother needed help. I told myself I would stay for 1 year after graduation, just 1 year, and then I would go to college. And the 1 year became two and then three. And then I met Richard. I met Richard Hargrove at a 4th of July picnic in the summer of 1981. He was 26 and I was 22, and he had come to Mill Haven to visit his college roommate whose family lived 3 streets over from mine. And someone had brought him to the picnic, and someone else had introduced us near the potato salad. And he had said something so unexpectedly funny that I had laughed with my mouth full and been mortified. And he had laughed at my mortification. And that was essentially that. He was not from money, not originally. His family was solidly middle class. His father owned a hardware store in Ohio. His mother taught piano lessons, and Richard himself was at that point 3 years into a job at a small manufacturing company in Pittsburgh, working in sales, earning a decent but unremarkable salary, with no particular indication that he was going to become anything other than what he already was: a pleasant, moderately ambitious young man with good manners and a gift for making people feel comfortable. But I saw something in him. I have never been entirely able to articulate what it was. That quality I recognized in Richard from the very beginning. Some combination of steadiness and curiosity, some fundamental decency that expressed itself not in grand gestures but in small consistencies, in the way he listened when you talked, really listened, not waiting for his turn to speak but actually taking in what you were saying and turning it over and responding to the thing you actually meant rather than just the thing you actually said. We dated long distance for a year, him in Pittsburgh and me in Mill Haven, phone calls every evening and visits every other weekend, and letters, actual handwritten letters, in between. My mother approved of him immediately. My father took longer, the way fathers do. But by Christmas of that first year, he was referring to Richard as that young man of yours, with a warmth that he rarely extended to anyone outside the immediate family. We got engaged in the spring of 1983 and married that October in the Methodist Church on Main Street, where I had been baptized and confirmed in a ceremony that was small by later standards. 40 people, a reception in the church hall, a cake my mother had baked herself. But that felt to me exactly right, exactly sufficient. I had never been a woman who dreamed of extravagant weddings. What I had dreamed of for as long as I could remember was a particular quality of companionship, a particular kind of being known, and standing at that altar next to Richard in his slightly too large suit, watching him try not to cry, I understood that I had found it. We moved to Pittsburgh. I got a job at an accounting firm. I had taken business classes at the community college during my years in Mill Haven, practical courses that now proved practical, and Richard continued at the manufacturing company, and we rented a small apartment in a neighborhood that was in the early stages of being described as up and coming, which meant it was inexpensive and occasionally alarming, but had good bones. Those early years were, I want to be honest about this, genuinely difficult in the way that early years often are, the way that is difficult to explain to people who haven't lived it, the difficulty of being young and strapped and figuring out how to be two people living as one without losing yourself in the process. We argued about money. We argued about whose turn it was to deal with the landlord. Richard worked long hours, and I resented it, and then felt guilty for resenting it because he was working those hours for us. I had moments of wondering whether I had made the right choice, not about Richard himself, but about the life, about leaving Millhaven, about all of it. But we were fundamentally, constitutively compatible, Richard and I. We shared a sense of humor. We shared a respect for each other's intelligence. We shared, and this, I think, was the most important thing, a commitment to honesty that was sometimes uncomfortable, but that meant we never let things fester, never let the small resentments calcify into something structural. When I was angry, I said so. When he was hurt, he said so. We fought cleanly and we made up thoroughly, and we came out of every disagreement with a slightly better understanding of each other. Daniel was born in 1985. He was a beautiful baby, enormous blue eyes, a shock of dark hair that fell out at 6 weeks and came back in a lighter brown, a serious expression that made everyone who met him say he looked like a little old man. I loved him with a ferocity that frightened me, that physical animal love of a first child that is unlike anything else in the human experience. I had not known I was capable of it. I had not known anyone was capable of it. Melissa came in 1987. She was the opposite of Daniel in almost every way. Where he was solemn, she was sunny. Where he was cautious, she was fearless. where he sat quietly and observed she threw herself at the world with both arms. She was also, from a very early age, the kind of child who understood exactly how to work a room, who knew instinctively which smile to deploy and when, who learned before she could write her own name how to get what she wanted through charm rather than demand. I noticed this quality in Melissa and found it simultaneously endearing and faintly worrying. The way you can admire a talent while intuiting that it might, in the wrong circumstances, become something less admirable. Christopher came in 1990, an accident in the most loving sense of the word, unplanned, but immediately completely welcome, the child who completed the family in a way that felt almost arithmetically necessary. He was gentle in the way that youngest children sometimes are, a little dreamy, a little soft around the edges, with an emotional attunement that both his older siblings lacked. He was the child who noticed when I was sad before I had said anything. He was the child who brought me flowers from the garden just because. He was the child who, 20 years later, would hold my hand in a courtroom and whisper, "Calm down, Mom," and mean it in a way the others no longer could. By the time Christopher was born, Richard had left the manufacturing company and started his own business, Hargrove Industrial Solutions, a company that provided specialized components and engineering consulting to mid sized manufacturers across the mid Atlantic region. It was a risk, and we both knew it was a risk. And we took it anyway because Richard had spent 8 years watching his employer make decisions he knew were wrong, and he had reached the point where he could no longer watch. The first 3 years were terrifying. There were months when I was not certain we could make payroll, months when I juggled credit lines with a precision that required my full concentration and left me lying awake at 3 in the morning running numbers in my head. I kept my job at the accounting firm. I managed our personal finances with a discipline that left no room for error. Richard worked 18-hour days and I covered everything else: the children, the house, the school pickups, and the pediatrician appointments, and the birthday parties, and the grocery shopping, and the meals, and the endless invisible architecture of a family's daily life. I want to be clear about something. I am not telling you this to claim martyrdom. I am not telling you this to suggest that Richard did not contribute equally in his way or that the arrangement was unfair because we had chosen it together with open eyes and it served the family we were building. I am telling you this because it is important later for you to understand what I had invested, not just financially, not just in time or labor, but in the deepest, most fundamental sense, in the sense of a life poured into a shared project, in the sense of years and decisions and sacrifices made not reluctantly, but willingly, gladly, because I believed in Richard and I believed in us, and I believed that what we were building was real and solid and worth everything it cost. The business succeeded. More than succeeded, it grew steadily and then dramatically as Richard's reputation spread and his client list expanded, and he made several key decisions in the mid 90s that positioned the company perfectly for the manufacturing boom of that decade. By 2000, we were wealthy by any reasonable definition. By 2005, we were wealthy by any definition at all. We moved to Fox Chapel. We bought the house, 6,000 square feet, 5 bedrooms, 3 acres of landscaped grounds, a kitchen I had designed myself after years of cooking in kitchens designed by people who apparently did not cook. We bought a house at the lake in New Hampshire where we spent summers and school breaks and the occasional long weekend when Richard could be pried away from the office. We took the trips I had dreamed about in the small Pittsburgh apartment: Italy, France, Japan, a safari in Tanzania that Christopher still talks about with a reverence usually reserved for religious experiences. The children grew up in comfort. They went to good schools. Daniel went to Penn, then Wharton, and joined the business. Melissa went to Georgetown, studied communications, married a man named Greg Castellano, who worked in finance and settled into a life in Shadyside that was expensive and social and apparently satisfying to her. Christopher went to Carnegie Mellon, studied architecture, and eventually opened his own small firm that designed, with great passion and modest profit, sustainable residential buildings for clients who cared more about environmental impact than square footage. We were, by every external measure, a successful family. We had money and health and a beautiful house and adult children who had achieved things and grandchildren who were delightful, and a marriage that had lasted 4 decades without losing its essential warmth and humor. When people looked at us from outside, I think they saw exactly the picture they expected to see: a prosperous couple in their 60s, comfortable and settled and fortunate. What they could not see, what I could not fully see, not until the papers arrived, was the fault line that had been developing beneath the surface for years. The slow geological shift in my children's relationship to the wealth they had grown up in, and to the parents who had created it, and to what they believed they were owed. Let me be precise about when I first noticed it. Not the greed. That was subtle, and it crept up gradually, but the specific quality of entitlement, the particular way in which comfort, over time, had curdled in at least 2 of my 3 children into something that concerned me. Daniel was the first sign. Not Daniel himself exactly, but Daniel's wife Courtney, who had grown up in money and therefore related to it with a proprietorial ease that initially struck me as simply confidence and only later revealed itself as something more troubling. Courtney had opinions about the house, what should be updated, what was dated, what the proper sort of people had in their homes. She had opinions about how Richard should be running the business, opinions she expressed indirectly through Daniel, with a consistency that suggested they were being deployed rather than casually offered. She also had an unnerving habit of asking questions about Richard's estate plans that she dressed up as concern, but that had the structure of reconnaissance. I just worry about you two not having everything in order, she would say, setting her wineglass down on a coaster she had brought with her because apparently ours were inadequate. At your age, you really should be thinking about these things. Richard and I were in our mid 60s. We were in excellent health. We were, as it happened, thinking about these things very carefully, but not in the way Courtney meant. Melissa was different. Melissa's entitlement expressed itself not through her spouse. Greg was actually fairly pleasant, if somewhat absent, but through herself, directly and without apology. She had grown up understanding that her charm was a tool, and she had spent her adult life deploying it with considerable skill. And it had worked often enough that she had come to believe, I think, that charm was not just a tool, but a substitute for other things, for discipline, for gratitude, for the basic acknowledgement that what you have was given to you by people who worked for it. She borrowed money. This started in her 30s when she and Greg went through a period of financial difficulty that was entirely the result of lifestyle decisions that bore no relationship to their actual income. It was never a large amount at once, always something specific, always with a particular story attached, always with a promise of repayment that was sometimes honored and sometimes not. Over the years, the total had become significant, not crippling. We could absorb it, but significant enough to be a pattern, significant enough that when I tried once, gently, to discuss it with her, she looked at me with those clear, practiced eyes and said, Mom, it's family money. Why does it matter which pocket it's in? I think about that sentence often. Why does it matter which pocket it's in? As if Richard and I were simply temporary custodians of assets that already, rightfully, belonged to our children. As if the decades of effort that had created those assets were merely a bureaucratic detail. Christopher was different from both of them. Christopher had grown up in the same house, with the same advantages, and had emerged somehow with his sense of proportion intact. He worked hard at his architecture firm, which did not make him rich, and seemed genuinely unbothered by this. He did not ask for money. He did not make pointed inquiries about estate plans. When he came for dinners, he talked to us, not at us, not round us, but to us, with the kind of genuine curiosity about our inner lives that I had not realized I was missing until I experienced its absence. He was also the only one of the three who truly understood his father's illness. Not medically, we all received the same information from the doctors, but emotionally, existentially. He was the only one who sat with Richard for long periods without filling the silence. He was the only one who asked Richard what he was afraid of and listened to the answer. He was the only one who seemed to understand that what was happening was not primarily a logistical problem to be managed, but a human experience to be witnessed. Richard noticed this too. In the 8 months of his illness, I watched Richard's relationship with his three children with a clarity that I might not have had in different circumstances. I watched Daniel's visits become gradually more business oriented, more focused on transition planning, and less focused on the man doing the transitioning. I watched Melissa's distress at her father's decline express itself, puzzlingly, mostly as distress about her own feelings. How hard this was for her, how she couldn't sleep, how she needed to be strong. But it was so difficult, in a way that somehow made Richard the audience for his own death rather than the protagonist. And I watched Christopher sit beside his father's bed on a rainy November afternoon, holding his hand, not saying anything, simply present in the way that presence, stripped of agenda, can be the most profound gift one person gives another. I noticed all of this, and I noticed too the conversations that began happening in the corners of the house. The murmured phone calls that stopped when I entered rooms, the looks exchanged between Daniel and Courtney that I was clearly not meant to intercept. The afternoon when I came home from a grocery run and heard Melissa say my name in a tone that did not sound like love before she heard my key in the lock and her voice changed. I said nothing. I was managing a dying husband and a household and my own grief, and I did not have the bandwidth for confrontations I wasn't sure I fully understood yet. But I was listening, and I was filing things away. And then there was the afternoon, 3 weeks before Richard died, when he pressed the USB drive into my hand. I did not open it immediately. I kept it in the drawer of Richard's study, in the back behind a box of paper clips and an old warranty card for a printer we no longer owned. And I went about the business of those final weeks with the strange double consciousness of someone who is fully present in one reality while holding the weight of another. Richard died on a Wednesday. The funeral was on Saturday. A large service, the kind of service that a man who had employed hundreds of people and touched thousands of lives accumulates, filled with faces I recognized and faces I didn't, and a grief that was communal and sincere, and that, paradoxically, made my own grief harder to access. There is something about being surrounded by other people's mourning that requires you to manage rather than experience your own. The reception afterward was at the house. Hundreds of people. Courtney had organized it, and she had organized it beautifully, and I was grateful for that, and I tried to hold on to the gratitude and not the other thing. The thing I had noticed when she introduced me to Richard's attorney, a man I had met a dozen times, as Richard's wife Elizabeth, with an emphasis on Richard that seemed to position me as a possession of the deceased rather than a living person with my own standing. The house emptied slowly over the following days. Family stayed through the weekend. Daniel and Courtney in the guest suite, Melissa and Greg in the blue room, Christopher on the pull-out couch in the study because he had offered before the others could claim rooms and had ended up with the worst option and had not complained once. The grandchildren were contained and confused. There were casseroles from neighbors. There were flowers everywhere, slowly dying. Monday came. Daniel and Courtney left for an early flight. Melissa and Greg followed that afternoon. Christopher stayed through Tuesday, helping me sort through immediate logistics, making sure I ate, sitting with me in the evenings in a companionable quiet that I needed more than I could have articulated. He drove home Wednesday morning, hugging me for a long time at the front door before he left. The papers arrived Wednesday afternoon. I want to tell you what it felt like to read them. Not the legal language. The legal language was clinical and cold in a way that still catches my breath when I think about it, but the experience of understanding what they meant. There was a motion to expedite probate proceedings and compel immediate inventory assessment of all marital and separate property. There were exhibits attached, financial statements, property assessments, a list of assets that must have required access to documents they should not have had. There was a request to place certain accounts in receivership pending distribution. It had been planned. It was not spontaneous grief expressing itself badly. It was planned, organized, documented, filed. They had hired lawyers, not one but two firms, while their father was still alive. While I was sitting beside my husband's deathbed, pouring Earl Grey tea that he could no longer drink, they had been on the phone with estate attorneys planning how to move fastest once he was gone. 6 days. They had waited 6 days, not even through the seventh day Mass, not even through the most basic gesture of respect. I sat with that knowledge for a long time, and then I went to Richard's study and I opened the drawer and I took out the USB drive. The file on the drive was a video. It was 47 minutes long. Richard had recorded it himself, on his phone, propped against a stack of books on the nightstand on a day when I had been out. I checked later and determined it was a Thursday in late September, a day when I had gone to the pharmacy and then to see my friend Margaret for coffee, a 2 hour absence that he had apparently used very deliberately. He was sitting up in the hospital bed that had replaced our regular bed by that point, wearing the blue cardigan I had given him for his birthday 2 years before. And he looked terrible, and he looked like Richard. The two things being simultaneously true in the way they were in those last months. And the first thing he said was, "Lizzie, if you're watching this, I'm gone, and I'm sorry. I'm sorry I had to do it this way. There are things I should have said to your face, but I knew if I tried, you'd have stopped me, and I needed to get through all of it." He paused. He looked directly at the camera with those gray eyes. "I know about the meeting," he said. I went very still. "I know Daniel and Melissa met with Gerald Fitch in August. I know what they asked him. Gerald told me he's been my attorney for 20 years, and he told me the same day, and I want you to understand that what I felt was not surprise. I wish I could tell you it was surprise. It wasn't. I had been watching this come for a long time, and I had been making plans, and I need you to know what those plans are because you are going to need them." What followed in the next 43 minutes was the most extraordinary thing I've ever witnessed. My husband, dying in a blue cardigan, quietly and methodically dismantling a scheme that our children had constructed and laying out in precise detail everything he had done to protect me from it. He spoke for a long time about the business, about the restructuring he had initiated 18 months earlier. Before the diagnosis, a restructuring that had moved significant assets into a trust structure that predated the illness and was therefore not subject to the same probate considerations that Daniel and Melissa were banking on. He spoke about the properties: the vacation house in New Hampshire, 3 commercial properties in Pittsburgh, a parcel of land in Vermont that had been appreciating quietly for 15 years, and what he had done with the deeds. He spoke about the investment accounts and the specific steps he had taken with their structure. He spoke about the conversation he had had with Gerald Fitch after learning about Daniel and Melissa's inquiry, and what Gerald had advised, and what Richard had done in response. And then, toward the end, he talked about Christopher. "Your brother knows nothing about any of this. he said, apparently addressing a camera he intended his children to eventually see. Christopher has never asked me for anything except my time, and I have not always given him enough of it, and that is one of my great regrets. What I have arranged for Christopher is separate from what you will find in the general estate, and I will not be telling you what it is or where it is because it is not your business, and because he earned it by being a good son, and I am not ashamed of that distinction. He looked at the camera again. He said, I know this will make you angry. I accept that. I have spent a great deal of my life trying to make everyone comfortable, and I have not always been honest about what I saw, because honesty was inconvenient and comfortable was easier. I should have been harder on you. I should have been clearer. I should have told you both years ago that the way you were moving through the world was going to cost you something. I'm telling you now. I hope it's not too late. And then, at the very end, he looked into the camera and his expression changed. It became something private, something intended for only one viewer. And he said, Lizzie, you have been the best thing in my life since a 4th of July picnic in 1981. And everything I built because of you and with you and for you, and it is yours. All of it. Do not let anyone tell you otherwise. Be strong. Not brave, strong. I watched the video 3 times. The first time I cried. The second time I took notes. The third time I listened the way an attorney listens, which is the way I had learned to listen over 40 years of managing the financial architecture of a complicated family life. Then I called Gerald Fitch. Gerald was 81 years old, had practiced estate law in Pittsburgh for 55 years, and had the calm, implacable demeanor of a man who had seen everything and been surprised by almost none of it. He had, as Richard had described in the video, anticipated this moment. He had, in fact, been anticipating it for a year and a half. Elizabeth, he said when I called, I've been waiting to hear from you. You knew they filed. I was notified this morning. I was giving you a day to breathe before I called. I don't need to breathe, I said. I need to understand what we have. We have everything, he said. Over the following 5 days, while my children's lawyers made motions and I made no response, while Daniel called twice and I spoke to him briefly and carefully and gave nothing away, while Melissa texted me things that ranged from conciliatory to vaguely threatening, and I responded to none of them. Over those 5 days, Gerald and I and a colleague of his named Patricia Weston, who specialized in contested probate and had the reputation of being, in Gerald's words, the most methodical human being I have ever encountered, prepared. We prepared the way Richard had wanted us to prepare, quietly, thoroughly, without a single leak. Christopher called on the fourth day. He had received a letter from Daniel and Melissa's attorneys. They had apparently included him on some correspondence, perhaps assuming he would be an ally, or perhaps not thinking about him carefully enough to have any strategy at all. He was calling from his car, pulled over somewhere, and I could hear in his voice that particular quality of controlled distress that I recognized as Christopher trying very hard not to fall apart. Mom, he said, tell me what's going on. Come to the house, I said. Tonight, don't call Daniel or Melissa first. He came. We sat in the kitchen, the same kitchen where I had drunk my tea 6 days earlier, where Richard's roses were still visible through the window in the October dark. And I told him most of it. Not the USB drive, not yet, not the full contents, but enough. Enough for him to understand the shape of what had happened and what was going to happen. He was quiet for a long time when I finished. I didn't know, he said finally. I know you didn't. I should have. You couldn't have, I said. This was between them and your father handled it. That's what you need to understand. He saw it coming and he handled it. Christopher looked at me with those eyes that were so much like Richard's, that same quality of direct, undeflected attention. Are you okay? He asked. It was such a simple question. It was the question no one else had asked me since Richard died. Not once. In all the condolence calls and casserole deliveries and professional consultations, everyone had asked how they could help, what I needed, whether things were in order. No one had asked if I was okay. No, I said honestly, but I'm going to be. The hearing was scheduled for the following Tuesday, 6 days after the papers were served. My children's lawyers had moved for an expedited hearing, and because probate courts in Allegheny County were not, at that moment, particularly backlogged, they had gotten one. This timing worked, I believed, slightly in their favor. They had anticipated, I think, that I would be too overwhelmed by grief and practicalities to mount an organized response in less than a week, that I would show up represented by whoever I happened to call first, that the hearing would be the beginning of a process they had choreographed and I was simply reacting to. They were wrong about that, but they didn't know they were wrong. I dressed carefully on Tuesday morning. Dark suit, good jewelry. Not ostentatious, but the real things, the pieces Richard had given me over the years for anniversaries and birthdays, small visible statements of a life built together. Gerald had told me to wear something that communicated stability. Patricia Weston had told me to wear something that communicated I was not a woman who could be intimidated. I had tried to find an outfit that communicated both, and I thought I had succeeded. Christopher picked me up at 9. He was wearing a dark jacket and looked pale and had clearly not slept. And when I got in the car, he looked at me for a moment with an expression I couldn't fully read and then said, "You look like someone who knows exactly what she's doing." "That's the goal," I said. We drove to the courthouse in near silence. I had the USB drive in my jacket pocket. I had a copy of the video on Gerald's secured server and on Patricia's as well, and there was a copy with my friend Margaret, who was not an attorney but who was the most reliable person I had ever known. I had not left anything to chance. The courtroom was small and fluorescent lit and smelled of old paper and industrial cleaner, the particular smell of institutions where important things happen in unglamorous settings. Daniel and Melissa were already there with their attorneys, 4 of them total, 2 from each firm, arranged along one side of the long table in a way that was clearly intended to communicate resources and organization. They were dressed for a different kind of proceeding than the one they were about to have. Melissa met my eyes when I entered, and for a moment her expression did something complicated, something that might have been guilt, or might have been the memory of guilt, or might have been simply the reflexive response of a woman who had always been skilled at reading rooms and who was perhaps reading this one differently than she had expected. Daniel did not look at me at all. He was speaking quietly to the attorney beside him, and he kept speaking. And this, more than anything, more than the papers, more than the legal fees they had incurred, more than the 43 minutes of a dying man's voice laying out the precise dimensions of his children's betrayal. This was what I found hardest to forgive, that he could not look at his mother. I sat down beside Gerald and Patricia. Christopher sat behind me. The USB drive was in my pocket, and I kept my hand very still and I did not touch it, and I waited. The judge was a woman named the Honorable Catherine Dreyfus, who was in her mid-50s and had a reputation, according to Patricia, for running an efficient courtroom and for being extremely difficult to manipulate. Patricia had said this as a compliment. I had taken it as one. Judge Dreyfus opened the proceedings briskly. She noted the motion, noted the expedited scheduling, noted the presence of counsel for both parties, and then looked over her reading glasses at the room in a way that suggested she found the entire situation faintly tiresome. "This is a motion to expedite inventory proceedings and compel asset accounting," she said. Counsel for the petitioners, please proceed. Daniel and Melissa's lead attorney, a man named Harrington, silver haired and confident in the manner of a person who had won enough courtroom arguments to have developed a perhaps excessive faith in his own persuasiveness, rose and began to speak. He spoke about the complexity of the estate. He spoke about the fiduciary responsibilities of the surviving spouse. He spoke about concerns expressed with great delicacy and great implication about the management of shared assets during the probate period. He spoke for 12 minutes and said nothing specific and implied a great deal. I listened. I watched Daniel and Melissa. Melissa was watching Harrington with an expression of carefully maintained composure. Daniel was still looking at the table. Christopher's hand came to rest briefly on my shoulder from the seat behind me and then withdrew. Counsel for the respondent? Judge Dreyfus said. Gerald rose. Gerald had been in courtrooms for 55 years, and he moved with the economy of motion of someone who has nothing to prove. He introduced himself and Patricia, explained that we were prepared to address both the procedural questions and the substantive ones, and then he looked at Judge Dreyfus and said, in a tone of perfect calm, Your Honor, we'd like to introduce an evidentiary exhibit at this time. It's a video recording made by the deceased Richard Hargrove approximately 3 weeks before his death, in which he speaks directly and at length to the questions before this court today. Harrington was on his feet before Gerald had finished the sentence. There was an objection about foundation, about authentication, about the proper process for introducing such evidence. There was a rapid and somewhat undignified exchange between the attorneys. Judge Dreyfus listened to it with an expression of someone watching a sporting event she had already decided the outcome of. Is this recording on a physical medium? She asked Gerald. Yes, Your Honor, a USB drive. Is there documentation of its provenance? Yes, Your Honor. The drive was delivered to Mrs. Hargrove by the deceased personally in the presence of a hospice nurse who is prepared to testify approximately 3 weeks before his death. Judge Dreyfus looked at Harrington. Your objection is noted for the record. I'm going to allow the recording. We will assess its admissibility on the substance. She looked at me. Mrs. Hargrove, please approach. I stood. I was aware of being watched by the attorneys, by Daniel, by Melissa, by Christopher behind me, by Judge Dreyfus, by a courtroom clerk who had looked up from her computer for the first time since the proceedings began. I was aware of my heels on the floor and the USB drive in my hand and the 41 years of marriage in the set of my shoulders. I handed the USB drive to the clerk. I am almost certain I heard, Melissa make a small sound. Not a word. Just a sound, soft and involuntary, the sound of something shifting. Daniel's attorney leaned toward him and whispered something urgent. Daniel shook his head, a small, tight motion. The clerk connected the drive to the courtroom's audio-visual system. Gerald had provided a transcript as well, which was distributed to all parties. The room was very quiet. Judge Dreyfus said, "Play the recording." And then there was Richard's voice. I will not tell you everything that happened in that courtroom over the following hour, because some of it belongs to the privacy of a family that was, in that room, coming apart and beginning, haltingly, to reckon with itself. But I will tell you the things that matter. Richard's voice was clear on the recording. The hospice had given him a pain management regimen that, by September, was effective enough that he had several hours each day of relative clarity, and he had used one of those hours to make this video with a precision and presence of mind that was evident in every sentence. He spoke about the trust structure. He spoke about the specific assets and their disposition. He spoke about Gerald Fitch and the steps he had taken. When he said, "I know about the meeting," Daniel closed his eyes. When he said the words "about Christopher," he earned it by being a good son, and I am not ashamed of that distinction. Melissa made a sound that was not quite a sob and not quite nothing. When the recording ended, The courtroom was silent for a long moment. Judge Dreyfus looked at the petitioner's table. Counsel, Harrington appeared, for perhaps the first time in a long career, uncertain of his footing. He conferred in urgent whispers with his co counsel and with Daniel and with the second attorney from the other firm. The conference lasted 2 minutes. Then he straightened and said, in a voice from which the silver confidence had somewhat departed, that the petitioners might wish to request a continuance to review the new evidence. Judge Dreyfus looked at him for a moment with the expression of someone who has heard more creative requests in her courtroom than this one and is not particularly impressed. Motion denied, she said. We will proceed. What followed was an hour of legal dismantling that I will not pretend I followed in every particular. Patricia Weston took over from Gerald at a certain point. She was younger, faster, with an encyclopedic command of the specific statutes that governed the trust structures Richard had established. And she was extraordinary. She went through the asset disposition with the methodical clarity that Gerald had described. And at each juncture, what became clear was the same thing. Richard had been very, very careful, and he had been careful for a very long time. And the picture that Harrington had tried to paint of an estate ripe for contested distribution was not the picture of the actual estate, and the discrepancy was now undeniable and on the record. The motion was denied in its entirety. Judge Dreyfus made a remark as she gathered her papers that was not strictly required by the proceedings, but that I have thought about many times since. She said, looking at the room in general rather than any party specifically, estate proceedings are at their most difficult when they are initiated from a place of grief or anxiety rather than a place of genuine legal concern. This court's resources are finite. I would encourage all parties to consider whether further litigation in this matter serves anyone's interests. Then she left. I sat for a moment after she left, in the fluorescent quiet of the small courtroom, with Gerald and Patricia beside me and Christopher behind me. And I was aware of Daniel and Melissa on the other side of the table in my peripheral vision, but I did not look at them. Not yet, because I needed a moment that was only mine. Richard had known. He had known, and he had prepared, and he had protected me, and he had done it all from a hospital bed in a blue cardigan while I was out getting prescriptions and drinking coffee with Margaret. And he had looked into a camera and called me Lizzie and told me I was the best thing in his life. And I had been given the extraordinary and devastating gift of hearing those words spoken directly to me by a man who was no longer in the world. I stood up. I picked up my bag. I turned. Daniel was looking at me now. He had finally found a way to look at me, and what was in his face was complicated guilt and defensiveness, and something that might have been the earliest, most reluctant shadow of remorse. Courtney was not in the courtroom. She had apparently not attended in person, a decision whose implications I filed away carefully. Melissa was looking at her hands. Christopher put his arm around my shoulders and said nothing, which was the right thing. I walked toward the exit. As I passed the petitioner's table, I paused. I did not stop exactly. I did not give them the gift of a full stop, a confrontation, a scene that would let them cast themselves as participants in something dramatic, rather than people who had done a thing and been caught doing it. But I paused, and I said quietly and clearly to both of them, Your father loved you. I want you to sit with that, and with what you did. And I want you to think very carefully about what kind of people you want to be for the remainder of your lives. Then I walked out. The aftermath of that day took months to resolve fully, and I will not claim that it resolved cleanly because human things rarely do. There were additional legal proceedings, not initiated by Daniel and Melissa, who had understood what the recording and the trust structures meant for their position, but procedural necessities of the probate process itself. There were conversations, some by phone, some in person, all of them painful in different ways, all of them necessary. There was a period of silence with both Daniel and Melissa that lasted longer than I had expected and that I had mixed feelings about, because grief needs silence sometimes, and so does clarity. Daniel and Courtney and I have reached, I would not call it reconciliation, not yet, perhaps not ever in the full sense, but a kind of functional peace. He came to see me 4 months after the hearing, alone without Courtney, and he sat in the kitchen where his father had drunk Earl Grey tea, and he said things that were hard for him to say and harder for me to hear. And I said things back, and we did not fix everything, but we cracked open a door that I thought might have been closed permanently. He has a long way to go. I have accepted that the relationship will not be what I once hoped it would be. That is a grief of its own kind, and I am learning to hold it alongside the other griefs. Melissa, I have seen twice. The first time was awkward and surface, and she cried in a way that seemed genuine but that I couldn't quite trust yet. The second time was better. A lunch, the two of us, without spouses or lawyers, and she said something that surprised me. She said she had been replaying her father's voice, saying, "He earned it by being a good son," and she had been asking herself for months whether she had earned anything, and she didn't think she had an answer yet. I told her the asking was the beginning. Christopher and I talk every week. He has become, in the way that crises sometimes reorganize families, the relationship that carries the most weight, not because he is the only one left, but because he has always been the one most interested in the actual truth of things. We are building something, he and I, in the space that grief has made, a different kind of closeness than what we had before, more honest, more deliberate, more aware of its own value. Richard's roses came fully into bloom in the spring. I have kept them. The house is large for one person, and sometimes the largeness is difficult, and sometimes it is exactly right. A space that holds the shape of everything that happened in it without crowding it. I have changed some things, rearranged the bedroom, had the kitchen updated in ways I had been meaning to do for years, and kept other things exactly as they were. The antique console table in the foyer. Richard's study, where I spend mornings now with coffee instead of tea, reading and thinking, and sometimes just sitting with the particular quality of quiet that 41 years of shared life leaves behind. I have thought a great deal about Richard's distinction. Be strong, not brave. Strong. I think he meant that bravery is a response to the moment, to the thing that frightens you, the thing that requires you to override fear and act anyway. Bravery is reactive. It responds to what comes at you. Strength is different. Strength is structural. It is the quality that allows you to hold your shape when pressure is applied, not because you are rigid, but because you know what you are made of. Strength is what my husband spent 41 years building in me, not always consciously, not always gently, but consistently, the way good soil builds good roots. He knew I had it. He knew it better than I did. And when the moment came, when the papers arrived and the drive was in my hand, and the courtroom was ahead of me, and my children had done the thing that children who have confused inheritance with love sometimes do, he was right. I want to close by saying something to anyone who is watching this who has been in a version of this place, who has been underestimated, who has been treated as an obstacle rather than a person, who has been maneuvered around by people who thought you were too busy grieving to pay attention. You are not too busy. You are never too busy. And the people who love you, who have truly loved you, they have been preparing the ground for you all along, leaving you what you need even when they can no longer stay to give it to you in person. Look for it. It is there. If this story has stayed with you, if you found yourself holding your breath at any point, if any piece of Elizabeth's journey touched something in your own experience, Please give this video a like and share it with someone who needs to hear it. Subscribe to this channel if you haven't already because we have many more stories like this one, stories about ordinary people who found extraordinary strength in the moments when they needed it most. And leave a comment below. I want to know, have you ever been underestimated by someone who should have known better? Have you ever found strength you didn't know you had? Tell me your story. I am here and I am listening. The way that really matters.